All right, let's dive into something pretty fascinating. We're talking DNA, but not just as a blueprint. We're thinking of it as like this historical record.
Yeah, so we're looking at Richard Dawkins and his book, The Genetic Book of the Dead, for this one.
Yeah, exactly. And this book is all about this wild idea, right? That our genes aren't just like an instruction manual for building our bodies. They're also packed with these stories of where we came from.
You got it. It's like, think of it this way. Your genes, they're a whole library.
Yeah.
And like each volume, it's a story about, your ancestors, all their struggles, their adaptations, how they survived, the whole thing.
Okay, I like that. That's a good image.
Yeah.
So, but how does nature actually write these stories? Like, what's the pen? How does that work?
Okay, so remember how DNA works.
Yeah.
It's all code, right? The sequence of information that basically determines your traits. And like any code, it can change, mutate.
Right.
So
right.
imagine like the environment just shifts. It gets way colder. Suddenly, some individuals, just by chance, they might have a mutation that pops up, gives them thicker fur.
Makes sense.
And boom, they're better suited. They're more likely to survive that cold, have kids, and pass that mutation on.
So like those beneficial mutations, those adaptations, they become part of the DNA over time. It's almost like nature's curating, picking the best stories for the next generation to inherit.
Exactly. Natural selection in action. It's always at work, shaping, editing that genetic code, make sure the survival stories keep getting told.
So like a polar bear, right?
Yeah.
That thick fur coat, the blubber, that's not just some random feature. It's a whole chapter in their genetic book.
Mm-hmm.
Tells you how their ancestors dealt with, the Arctic.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. And then you compare that to, say, a cheetah. That sleek body built for speed, that's a different story altogether. It's the African savanna. You got to be fast to survive there. And their DNA, it's proof. It's a record of generations of cheetahs who needed that speed to make it.
It makes you think about what stories are in our human genes. Like what helped our ancestors make it?
Yeah, fascinating question.
Maybe they had to be great storytellers to survive. Maybe that's why I'm doing this right now.
Maybe. But remember, our way of recording history, it's totally different.
Right.
We use writing, images, all that nature's way. It's this elegant code DNA to store its history. It's like comparing a cave painting to some crazy complex computer program.
I see what you mean. Earlier you mentioned this thing, the red clean hypothesis.
Right.
What's that got to do with our genes?
That's key to understanding this whole genetic history thing. It's about the constant pressure to evolve. Like, imagine a gazelle that can outrun a lion. Great, right.
Yeah.
But lions, they're evolving too. They're getting faster, stronger. So that gazelle, it's got to keep evolving too, becoming even faster just to stay alive.
So it's not enough to just be good enough. You got to constantly adapt to stay ahead. It's like a never-ending arms race.
Exactly. You got it. And the evidence of that arms race, the wins, the losses, it's all there in the DNA. Each adaptation, each little change in the code, it tells a story about some challenge that got overcome.
So DNA, it's not just a blueprint. It's like this chronicle of survival. But okay, what can we actually do with this information? Like, what's the practical side of reading this genetic book?
Now that's where things get really exciting. This whole understanding of evolutionary history, it's got huge potential for stuff like medicine, conservation, you name it. Like, imagine tracing how a disease has evolved through a population's genes.
Okay, yeah.
We could understand its weaknesses, create treatments that are much more targeted, effective.
Wow, so we're not just fighting the disease, we're trying to understand its whole journey.
Exactly. And in conservation, think about it. We could predict how species might react to, say, climate change based on how they adapted to past shifts. It's like having a window into the past to guide us in the future.
That's incredible. But I'm sure there are folks out there who'd be, a little skeptical. Did the book review mention any criticisms of Dawkins' ideas?
Oh, for sure. Not everyone's on board with every detail of Dawkins' theory. Some reviewers, they pointed out the book's pretty theoretical, more thought experiments than hard data. They thought it might be tough for readers who aren't super familiar with, complex scientific stuff.
Yeah, good point. Not exactly light reading material.
Not really. But even if the book's a bit challenging, the ideas themselves, they're incredibly thought-provoking.
This whole genetic book of the dead thing, it's really making me think about DNA, evolution, all of it in a whole new light. It's not just about inheritance. It's about these stories of survival that are literally encoded in us. But before we get too philosophical here, let's get into some specific examples. In the next part of this deep dive, we'll explore how scientists are actually using DNA to unlock the secrets of the past. Stay with us.
We're back and ready to unlock some of those secrets you mentioned. So, how are scientists actually using DNA to read this genetic book, to uncover that history that's hidden inside?
Well, okay, it's not quite as simple as just, opening a book and reading the words. It's more like they're deciphering this ancient language.
Oh,
They're
okay.
comparing DNA sequences from different people, different species, looking for patterns and variations and stuff.
I see.
They analyze mutations, those
Yeah.
tiny little changes in the code to figure out how organisms adapted over time.
So it's kind of like being a detective, right? Piecing together clues from the DNA to reconstruct the past. Yeah, exactly. And they're using some pretty amazing tools to do it. They use these things called molecular clocks.
Molecular clocks.
Yeah, it helps them estimate evolutionary timescales, based on how fast mutations build up. It's like having a time machine.
Wait, a time machine. Okay, hold on. How does that work?
So think about human migration, right?
Huh.
By comparing the genomes of different human populations all over the world, scientists can actually trace the migrations of our ancestors out of Africa.
Wow.
They can see how groups branched out and spread across the globe, taking their genetic stories with them.
So they're making like a genetic map of human history. It's like tracing our family tree back thousands of years.
Exactly. It really is. And they're doing similar things with other species, too. They've tracked the spread of ancient horses across continents, the evolution of whales from land-dwelling ancestors, and even reconstructed the family tree of extinct creatures like mammoths.
It's mind-blowing, really, that we can learn so much about the past from something as small as a strand of DNA.
It really is. And the discoveries keep coming. Recently, scientists analyzed the DNA of ancient plague victims to
Huh.
understand how the bacteria that caused the Black Death evolved.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and this kind of research can help us prepare for future pandemics.
It seems like there's no end to what we can learn from this genetic history. But, when we talk about history, we often focus on the big events, wars, revolutions, that kind of stuff. But what's so interesting about this genetic book is that it captures those everyday struggles,
Right.
those struggles for survival that shape life as we know it.
That's such a good point. Because it's those small adaptations. The tiny changes in a gene that let an organism survive a drought or escape a predator. Those are the changes that led to the incredible diversity of life we see today.
So it's not just about kings and queens. The real heroes are the genes that helped organisms make it through another day, another generation.
You got it. And by understanding those survival stories, we gain a deeper appreciation for how resilient life is, how adaptable it is, and maybe even find inspiration for how we can adapt to the challenges we face today.
That takes us back to those practical applications, right?
Exactly. If we can figure out how a plant species adapted to drought thousands of years ago, we might be able to use that knowledge to develop crops that can handle the droughts of the future.
So we're not just reading history. We might actually use it to write a better future.
Exactly. And it goes beyond agriculture, too. Imagine understanding the adaptations that allowed certain animals to survive past pandemics.
Yeah.
That could be huge for developing vaccines and treatments for human diseases.
This is all very promising, but I'm a pretty visual person. Is there a way to actually see this genetic history? Can we picture what these ancient organisms look like, how they behaved, that sort of thing?
It's not like watching a documentary or anything.
No.
But scientists can use DNA to reconstruct what extinct species look like. Like how big they were, their shape, even their color, all based on their genes.
So it's like a genetic artist's rendering of a creature that's long gone.
Exactly. And by comparing the DNA of modern species, we can guess things about their behavior, too. Were they loners or did they live in groups? How did they hunt, raise their young? DNA holds clues to those ancient lifestyles.
It's truly amazing how much information is packed into those little strands of DNA. But this idea of constant adaptation, this Red Queen's race,
Yeah.
it makes me wonder, are we humans still evolving?
That's a great question, and the answer is yes, absolutely. We are still evolving. The pressures might be different now than what our ancestors faced. We're not just running from predators or hunting for food,
Right.
but the principle is the same: adapt or disappear.
So what kinds of evolutionary challenges are humans up against today?
Well, think about antibiotic resistance. For example, bacteria are constantly evolving to beat the drugs we use to fight them. It's the Red Queen hypothesis in action. We have to keep making new antibiotics just to keep up.
It's like this microscopic battle going on inside our bodies. What else?
Well, how about how we've adapted to city life? coping with pollution, stress, or all that, or how our immune systems are always evolving to deal with new viruses and diseases. We might not see these changes happening in real time, but they're there in our genes.
So the human story, it's still being written in our DNA, makes you wonder what our genetic book will look like thousands of years from now. What
Mm.
stories will it tell about our journey through this century and beyond?
That is a question for the future, but it's a reminder that we're not just watching evolution happen, we're part of it.
Right.
Our choices, our actions, they all become part of the story of life on Earth.
It is humbling when you think about it, that we're all part of this huge story that's been unfolding for billions of years.
Yeah.
And will keep going long after we're gone.
Ah,
We've covered a lot in this deep dive. DNA is a historical record, the constant pressure to adapt, and the incredible potential of all this knowledge. But there's one more piece to explore. What are some of the bigger questions this raises? The philosophical and ethical implications of reading this genetic book of the dead. We'll tackle those in the final part of our deep dive. Stay with us. Welcome back for the final part of our deep dive into the genetic book of the dead. We've looked at the science, the history, all that potential of reading our DNA. But now let's think about some of the bigger picture stuff.
it really makes you think, doesn't it? Like this idea of DNA as this historical record, it kind of changes how we see ourselves in the whole scheme of things. We're not just, individuals living right now. We're linked to this massive web of life going back like billions of years.
It's almost like we each have this universe of stories inside us. All these stories of survival and change and adaptation, all written in the language of our genes. But if we can read those stories, decode that language, where does it lead us?
That's where things get really interesting. And kind of complicated, It makes us think about some pretty deep philosophical questions.
Yeah.
Like, what does it actually mean to be human once we get how connected we are to everything else on Earth?
Right.
What does it say about who we are, where we came from, those big questions?
It really makes you wonder if we're just scratching the surface of what our genes can tell us
Mm.
about ourselves, our history, maybe even our future.
Absolutely. And the deeper we dig into this genetic book, the more we got to think about what it all means. Like, what happens when we can read not just the history of, humankind, but an individual's whole genetic makeup?
Yeah.
How do we use that knowledge responsibly? That's a big one.
It's a lot to think about. And I
Yeah.
think it shows why it's so important to be talking about this now. As this tech keeps getting better, we have to make sure we're using it ethically for good.
Couldn't agree more. As we uncover these secrets in our genes, we got to be curious, yeah, but also cautious. Always asking not just, can we do this, but should we?
It's kind of like opening Pandora's box, isn't it? Once we unlock these secrets, there's no going back.
Right.
But I'd like to think, instead of unleashing a bunch of chaos, we can use this knowledge to shed light on our past, understand our present, and maybe even make a better future.
I like that. Well said. And at the end of the day, that's what makes this whole concept of the genetic book of the dead so fascinating. It's not just about looking back. It's about seeing what we're capable of as a species.
It's a good reminder that we're all part of something way bigger than ourselves.
Yeah.
This story that's been going on for like billions of years. And it'll keep going long after we're gone.
And who knows what incredible stuff we'll find in our DNA? What other secrets are waiting to be discovered as we keep exploring this amazing genetic book?
That's a great question for our listeners to ponder. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the genetic book of the dead, we hope you'll keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and keep being amazed by the natural world. Until next time, keep diving deep.